During the Constitutional Convention of 1787, slavery was a major topic of debate between the delegates who were outlining the new government of the United States. Several founding fathers attempted to outright abolish slavery in the Constitutional Convention itself. John Adams and Alexander Hamilton made several attempts which were shot down due to the necessity of keeping the Southern states in the convention and preventing them from simply not ratifying the new Constitution. After all, the Constitutional Convention itself was an act of treason, as it intended to dismantle the existing government of the United States under the Articles of Confederation. The compromise reached to keep the slave states from leaving was reflected in several provisions of the Constitution. The 3/5 Compromise, for example, counted enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of determining a state's population and its representation in Congress. This compromise bolstered the political power of Southern states, as it increased their representation in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. Additionally, the Constitution included the Fugitive Slave Clause, which required escaped slaves to be returned to their owners, further entrenching the institution of slavery in the legal framework of the nation. Despite these compromises, efforts to abolish slavery persisted in the years following the ratification of the Constitution. Abolitionist movements gained traction in the North, fueled by moral and religious arguments against slavery. However, the economic interests of the South, combined with political divisions over states' rights and federal authority, continued to hinder progress towards emancipation. The early American economy was heavily dependent on slavery, particularly in the southern states where large-scale plantations produced lucrative cash crops such as cotton, tobacco, and rice. Enslaved laborers were central to the production progress, working in harsh conditions under the control of plantation owners. The economic prosperity built on slavery came at a profound human cost. Enslaved individuals endured brutal living and working conditions, and families were torn apart as people were bought and sold as property. Despite its economic importance, slavery remained a deeply divisive and morally reprehensible institution. The struggle to abolish slavery would continue to shape American history, culminating in the Civil War and the eventual passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery throughout the United States in 1865. But what if this entire course of action had changed? What if, in an altered timeline, the United States somehow managed to gain its independence and simultaneously make the radical move to abolish slavery in the Constitution? The vague abolitionist notion that permeated many of the delegates, particularly the Northern delegates, was initially suppressed by the conventioneers in order to court the Southern states. However, one man among the many in the delegation refused to allow a United States to continue practicing the institution of slavery. Benjamin Franklin, in his 80s, a wise, stubborn, and dry fellow, hammered his cane on the wooden floor of the convention room. A hush fell over the debating delegates as he cleared his throat. Franklin, one of the architects of the American Revolution and one of the most prudent founding fathers of the nation, stood up from his chair and weakly hobbled to the center of the room. Without skipping a beat, he raised his voice, declaring to the convention that he would not support the moral inkblot that was the institution of slavery, and that he would not concede to anything except the absolute abolition of slavery within the Constitution. Immediately, an uproar of defiance arose from the Southern delegates, and one of confusion from the Northerners. It was a topic too divisive for such a key figure to take such a hardline stance on. Franklin hammered his cane on the floorboards once more, hushing the delegates again. He proceeded to speak in a raspy but warm voice to the delegates, eyeing the Northerners in particular. He appealed to the Christian faith of his fellow delegates, which, he argued, provoked them to renounce the enslavement of their fellow man. He appealed to their shared values of liberty and posterity, and argued that the law of the land could not be considered moral and of God if it did not reject the institution of slavery. The Northern delegates looked around at one another. Washington, from the back of the room, raised an eyebrow at his old Pennsylvanian friend, but remained quietly watching the expressions of the others to gauge their reactions to the proposal. Hamilton and Adams motioned their agreement with Franklin, followed by several of their colleagues in the would-be Federalist camp. James Madison paused, looking around the room, and then stood up in agreement. The convention became a prolonged argument between the Southerners and Northerners over the issue and over the perceived overreach of the federal government that such an abolition would be. Some of the more moderate Southerners argued that the issue should obviously be one that the states get to decide, and that if the Northerners wanted to abolish slavery, they could do so in their own states, but many of the Southerners simply refused to go any further. This was the straw that broke the camel's back, and most of the delegates from the Carolinas, Georgia, Virginia, and Maryland left the convention altogether. The convention continued anyway, and ratification occurred among the northern states. The United States remained in this odd state of purgatory, as the northern states adopted a far more federalist constitution, and the southern states continued under the Articles of Confederation. Virginia existed between both worlds, as George Washington led the state begrudgingly to ratification, but much of the state refused to acknowledge the new constitution. This radically disunited America was economically dependent on Europe and politically fractured. The southern states acted as independent nations, trading with the British and maintaining the status quo of the Articles, while the northern states scrambled to organize a government which their citizens and the powers of Europe would recognize as legitimate. Over the course of the next decade, as slavery became less profitable to an unindustrialized South, Maryland and North Carolina would join the Union and begin to phase out the institution of slavery, but Georgia and South Carolina would refuse. The two final independent states facing threat from the Spanish to the south, the Native Americans from within, and an economy that was unsustainable without the industrial might of the North, would finally join the Union by 1800. By this time, uncontested Federalist power had reshaped the early United States into a much more united, top-down country than we are used to. This United States, while stronger internally, is weaker on the world stage and has a harder time expanding to the West and integrating more and more territories into its already massive country. The Louisiana Purchase still occurs, as Napoleon wishes to get rid of the territories, and the United States is the obvious answer to his predicament. The US, however, is less inclined to go to war with Britain in 1812, as their economy is still industrializing, and the northern states have to focus large amounts of resources on reorganizing and revitalizing the South. There is, of course, no civil war, as the United States pushes westward gradually, fighting off the Mexican Empire and resettling black and white Americans in the new territories acquired by the Louisiana Purchase. More of Western Canada may be settled by Americans, and the Oregon Territory may extend further into British Columbia, but for the most part, America is simply relegated to a role closer to that of its South American counterparts in the Empire of Brazil or Gran Colombia, a regional power that isn't immediately important to European interests. A few other minor developments may occur. With the abolition of slavery in Jamaica in 1834, a movement to integrate the island into the United States could see some successes, although the British would likely not allow such a motion to happen. The United States may play a greater role in liberating colonies in the Caribbean, especially ones with large Afro-Caribbean populations. The most important outcome of this change, however, would lay in the history books. Slavery would be seen in history as an institution imposed on America by the imperialist British, and the racial division between black and white, while it still obviously would exist to some extent, is by far not as pronounced as it is in our timeline. The concept of brotherhood between the races and equality under the law becomes a form of national pride for the United States and a point of moral superiority of the United States over Britain. Thank you so much for watching. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have new videos like this one every week, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. A special thanks to everyone who has donated to us on Patreon and through channel memberships on the main channel. Support from our patrons and donors helps make regular videos possible, and every donation goes a long way to keeping our channels going. If you can't donate anything, please consider subscribing on here and on our main channel and sharing this video to help out. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Mr. Z out.